Howdy folks, it is time for our lecture on the Progressive Era. So we're going to return to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and which means, remember, 1890 to like 1920. And we are going to get back into our conversation about capitalism and the way that things are changing. Now, we're not going to talk entirely about the Progressive Era today because the progressive politics of the Progressive Era happen at various levels. It would be more accurate to call this lecture the Presidential Progressive Era, because we're very much so just going to focus on the office of the presidency. But if we count progressive, and we should, as shit that people were doing to change capitalism, that actually encompasses the women and the laborers and other folks that we have talked about thus far are incorporated under that general term, the Progressive Era. But today we're going to focus specifically on presidential politics, because I want to get you caught up on who was president during what times, because that story largely helps us understand the role that business played. And then I want to talk about Teddy Roosevelt, because I like Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is pretty flippin' awesome. Total homeboy. So I'm going to talk about him when we get there. So here we go. What do you need to know today? Things you were supposed to learn. You were supposed to learn what and who challenged laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire capitalism is hands-off capitalism. Basically, capitalism by capitalism's rules. Laissez-faire means that there's no regulation of it. And this had been what capitalism was, right? Like that was Andrew Carnegie, Gospel of Wealth. That was like rampant capitalism. Who was the people that were like, that might not actually be fantastic, and did something about it? How did the federal government work to place checks on capitalism? What was their role? What did they do? And then what legacies did Teddy Roosevelt leave? Because, again, Teddy Roosevelt is cool, and he definitely goes on my list of like top 10 people that I would risk tuberculosis to meet. He is on that list. He's not the top of that list, but he is definitely on that list. So, what legacies did Teddy Roosevelt leave? What did he do? That kind of thing. Let's get started. So I want to start with a question, and the question is, if we are looking at the world that capitalism created, and that's what the Gilded Age is, right? The Gilded Age is, it's what capitalism made. So if we are looking at that world, who would have been not necessarily super cool with that world? It turns out that there were not a small number of people that were discomforted by the changes that industrialism had wrought. And I mean the poverty, right? Primarily, I mean the poverty, but I mean a host of other issues too. We're not just talking about poverty, we're talking about the growth of cities. We're talking about a rapidly expanding military. We're actually aggressively, imperialistically pushing abroad, which I'll talk about in another lecture. We are talking about increasing commodities and all the changes that we talked about with the Industrial Revolution, right? Who's not happy with that? Who has reservations? Who's over there in the corner going, hang on tight for a sec? The answer is a lot of people. A lot of people are not necessarily the beneficiaries of this new system. The Andrew Carnegies of the world are the ones that are completely comfortable with it. And those people have a disproportionate amount of power. Because those people, in an age of, and I'll explain why in a second, corrupt politics really do a lot of the controlling, right? But there are a lot more people in the world. White northern laborers and immigrant laborers in both the North and the South. I would say laborers in the South, white laborers in the South, but frankly, there weren't that many of them. So yes, that too, right? But factory laborers, industrial laborers, whether they were white or black or immigrant. And these folks existed throughout the nation. Increasingly, Black people were migrating for factory jobs in the Northwest from the South. That process is called the Great Migration. So they are included in this, right? They wouldn't necessarily be happy with those changes. But there were more. Black Southerners, people in the South that are like, hey, the more cotton that you demand up north, the worse that sharecropping gets, and this doesn't have anything to do with us. Western farmers who are angry about the governmental support of big business and a lack of focus on farmers and farmers' needs. white small planters in the South that are very angry at the way that the economy in the South is just neglected in industrialization. Women, women bear the brunt of industrialization in a lot of ways. They take some of the dirtier, nastier jobs. They are not paid as well as men, and they are not compensated for their labor in a way that makes it worthwhile. So for women, this is also hard. And there's a growing class of people too, a sympathetic class of white middle class reformers, people who themselves didn't necessarily suffer the economic ravages of industrial development, but people that were looking at the world around them and were saying, this isn't right. Poverty and inequality this way, it's just not right. And the reason is that the world of the Gilded Age was not just inequality among people. It was inequality of opportunity. And that's what made middle class reformers really uncomfortable. So there's a host of people that are not comfortable with this world that industrialization created, either because they don't have the power or because they're seeing this disjuncture in how things are set up. The problem was those people were relatively disorganized. We're talking about like really, really disparate populations. They don't have a political party, right? Actually, Republicans had a political party and they were massively strong, and they were the party of big business. So the Republicans were the power that they used to be the Whigs. And the Whigs were the party of industrial development prior to the Civil War. The Republicans kind of adopted the Whigs, and their whole thing was support the North in the war. But then the war was won, and they kind of returned to those roots of supporting industrialization and national development. So the Republican Party was very much so the pro-business, pro-development party. And I just want to trace this string of presidents with you. And this is going to be a real quick bio of each of these dudes. But essentially what I want you to get a sense of is the way that the office of the president was pretty much monopolized by Republican principles, if not just by Republicans. So for instance, Ulysses S. Grant. So Ulysses S. Grant, totally cool guy in a lot of regards. He was elected in 1868 because everybody was angry at Andrew Johnson for reasons that we discussed earlier, and the Republicans pretty much just swept the polls. And they were able to take the office with this guy who was an ex-military hero. He basically won the Civil War for the Union, and he was a military dude. Like, his understanding of control was military. It was not, he didn't have a real great grasp on economics. Or at least I realize that's a controversial thing to say, but that's what many historians have argued. Because of that, he actually relied a lot on his advisors for economic help. His advisors were all very staunch, pro-business people in the North. And Grant actually really kind of got taken advantage of in this regard. Grant supported the gold standard, which is this idea that the only money that should be worth anything in the United States is gold, and all paper money has to be backed by gold. Banks liked this. Wealthy industrialists liked this. Poor farmers in the South and in the West did not like this, but the big bankers had the ear of Grant. So Grant really pushed for the gold standard. In fact, and he managed to have it adopted, but then there was significant corruption underneath him when people tried to keep the price of gold artificially high. What's important about this? What's important is that the Grant administration was focused on other things. The Grant administration was focused on eradicating the KKK and making sure that the Freedmen's Bureau survived and making sure that freed people got their voting rights. Grant himself was not terribly focused on curbing Northern industry. And Northern industries, through their representatives in government, kind of took advantage of the Grant administration in that regard. Grant left the presidency after a couple of terms in the really super contested election of 1876. And in that super contested election, if you remember what we talked about, in a really informal compromise, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, won against Tilden, the Democratic candidate, on the condition that they pulled troops out of the South, which happened. So the Republican Party takes office. The Republican Party pulls troops out of the South, and the Republican Party returns to its very pro-business roots. So Hayes is very much so the return of the Republican Party to this pro-business, pro-industrial development kind of stance. And we know this because of the ways that he worked. He maintained the gold standard, even though there was a lot of controversy about it. He is also the first guy that sent federal troops to suppress labor agitation, which we talked about in an earlier lecture. So Hayes is definitely not a labor-friendly guy. Hayes is very much so a big business supporter. Hayes was succeeded by James Garfield. Garfield, to his credit, really wanted to see the spoils system revoked. So he was a guy that really wanted to bring credibility back to the Republican office, because after this guy and this guy, people thought that Republicans were pretty corrupt. So Garfield really wanted to change that. He wanted to be he wanted to support businesses, but he also really wanted to bring a good name back to the Republican Party. In order to do that, he wanted to get rid of something called the spoils system. The spoils system was a system in which people who wanted to be president would, if they became president, appoint their supporters into cabinet positions. So, you know, you gave me a lot of money for my campaign, I'm going to give you this really cushy job. Garfield really wanted to get rid of that. Ironically, he was assassinated by somebody that he didn't give a spoils job to about 6 months into his term, making him the second shortest president ever to keep office. He was succeeded by Chester Arthur. Arthur did get rid of the spoils system, but he still was supportive of Northern business, slightly more supportive probably than Garfield would have been, particularly through international tariffs. Those tariffs were ways to protect American industry from competition. So things that said imported steel is really expensive so that people have to buy American steel, which was monopolized, that kind of thing. So he put protective tariffs on a lot of businesses, and he really supported Northern businesses in general. Then there was Grover Cleveland. He was a Democrat, but he was elected despite the popularity of Republicans because he promised to be a pro-business Democrat. And he very much so supported businesses, again, by catering to wealthy people, by supporting business in labor agitation, by refusing to meet with labor. He was, again, very much so a president of businesses. And this indicated that, like, labor had no party. Labor had no ability to put forward a candidate. If they weren't Democrats and they weren't Republicans, what were they exactly? He was followed by Benjamin Henry Harrison, who again placed high tariffs on foreign goods, keeping American goods high. So again, until 1893, we get another super business president. In 1893, Cleveland is president again, but his reputation is hurt by the Panic of 1893. It's during this Panic of 1893 that he really sides with business against labor agitation, using federal force to put those protests down. During this period then, right, like we talked about this, all of these folks, all of these guys, I'm just now realizing kind of look a little similar. They look a little similar to you? Certainly Hayes and Garfield look similar. I would say Hayes, Garfield, and Harrison look similar. Anyway, that's not the focus today. The focus is that for all of these dudes, there were basically no checks on the kinds of corruption that could take place in political office and in government. So we talk about corruption a lot. I want to talk about a couple of ways that corruption actually happened. Like, what did corruption actually look like? And most of these things were not illegal, right? We talked about the spoils system, which eventually became illegal in name, although it did still happen a little bit in fact. But all the rest of these were completely legal for a long time. Things that could happen. You could solicit votes or bribe votes. This happened particularly to new immigrant communities, right? Like, I will make sure that your community is protected if you make sure that this candidate is elected. Mob bosses are basically that. Like, you run these rings to support political candidates. You could set price leaders. So like the great leaders of the steel industry could get together and say, all right, everybody, nobody go lower than this price for steel. And by doing so, they would basically say that the price had to be that high, price setting, that everybody would have to pay that and they would make more profit. They're informal deals. Monopolization, which we talked about, the vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical being buying every company along a certain, within a certain industry, and vertical being buying every component. Like if you were going to do cars, you would buy the steel and you would buy the company that makes the leather and you would buy the various different things, right? Horizontal integration being just competing companies, buying all the competing companies. Lobbying administration to set policies that were favorable, that allowed for all of these things. Actually bribing the administration to, say, give certain land grants to railroads. And patronage systems for federal employees. Say that you are paid annually this much by the railroad industry, and we just expect that whenever issues come up, you are going to support the railroad industry. So there's a lot of corruption, and most of these things are not underhanded things. Like most of these things are fairly out in the open and fairly legal. So people began to say, that's not cool, right? One of the earliest parties to do this was the Populist Party. Now, the Populist Party actually emerged out of farmers in the West. It did not emerge among laborers in the Northeast, although you might have expected it to. The Populist Party was about mostly Western farmers that wanted to see a couple of things. They wanted to see a direct election of senators. They wanted to see an income tax that would be cheaper for poor people than for wealthy people. They wanted to abolish the national banking system to support local banks. They wanted to restrict immigration to restrict competition. And they wanted the coinage of silver. They particularly wanted the coinage of silver because that would have taken power away from the banks and given it much more to average people. It was started among farmers in the West, but it did gain the support of many African Americans in the South, and it gained the support of some laborers in the North, although most laborers in the North were pretty well controlled by the Republican Party. The Populist Party was so powerful, in fact, that it kind of usurped the Democratic Party in the election of 1896. They put forward William Jennings Bryan. Now, William Jennings Bryan is famous for campaigning in this election on the slogan, "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." In other words, no gold coinage. We want to see silver coinage. You can see in this that Bryan secures the Midwest, all of the West and the South. So again, this is reflecting the farmers, right? And this is reflecting the alliances that are made down there. McKinley, as a Republican, manages to take the North. And unfortunately for Democrats, McKinley wins. This, though, is an important election because it catapults us into what we call the fourth party system. Now, if you haven't taken me or Professor Haney before, you might not know that political parties have changed over the course of time. What the word Republican means actually doesn't really have much to do with the Republican Party. What democracy means doesn't actually necessarily have much to do with the Democratic Party. So these are terms that have shifted. What Democrats wanted in 1890 was not the same thing that Democrats wanted in 1990. These are just different systems. We call the moments of change different parties. So the different party systems. So the fourth party system is a party system in which what Republican meant was to be the party of big business, to support protectionist tariffs, to support imperialism. We're going to talk about imperialism in a future lecture. To support the gold standard, to support a lack of government regulation on the economy. Democrats were changing, though. Democrats used to be the party of the South in that they used to be racist white people that wanted war. These used to be the people that were ardent segregationists, right? But increasingly, the Democrats were the party of poor laborers, and Western farmers. They pushed for silver, they pushed for a focus on internal economy rather than external economy, and they really opposed the power of big business. They were really unique in that they managed to actually get some African Americans and white people to vote on the same side in the South. So this is a different party system, and things are really shifting. But McKinley is president from 1897 to 1901. One of the most pro-business presidents. McKinley basically didn't think that he should do anything. He definitely supported the gold standard. He made the transition to a fully gold-based economy. But other than that, like, he didn't feel like the office of the presidency should be that strong. Probably for these reasons, in 1901, he was assassinated by an anarchist. His death really leads us into what we call the Progressive Era. Now, this is the time for definitions. If that was the background that I wanted to give you on all of the very Republican, very pro-business people, right? That was an era when we couldn't get anything else done. What happens next is the Progressive Era. The way that this changes is that we are seeing people that are increasingly uncomfortable actually get political power to start addressing some of those moments of discomfort. It started earlier than this in other areas with progressive reformers, but this is when it gets into presidential politics because this dude takes over the presidency. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was the vice president of William McKinley. Now, this happens occasionally in US history. So when you're running for office, you pick a running mate, someone to run for vice president, who generally balances out your ticket. So Roosevelt was actually a lot more progressive than McKinley. McKinley picked Roosevelt because of that, so that people who were more progressive would be more comfortable voting for McKinley. McKinley, of course, was not counting on being shot and having Roosevelt take over the office of the presidency, at which point the presidency became much more progressive. And what do I mean by progressive? Well, when he got into office, Roosevelt said, I'm going to cut you a square deal. In other words, we're going to act fairly between the president and the American people. And he basically thought that the presidency should be super engaged in the economy, in regulating business, in doing a whole bunch of things. So, easy way to remember this? 3 C's. There were 3 things that he wanted to make sure happened under his presidency. He wanted to protect consumers, consumer protection. He wanted to conserve nature, and he wanted to control industry. We're going to talk about each of those in turn. Let's talk first about controlling industry. So in 1890, an act passed through the federal government called the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was supposed to cut down on trusts, which is another name for monopolies that have political power. So you can see in this political cartoon, the Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, the Standard Oil Trust. These are kind of the fat cats that sit in the back of the room and determine what happens in the Senate, right? That's what the cartoon is saying. The people's entrance is closed. Entrance for monopolies is open. People can come in here, and they control this. Here's coal, iron, nails, the sugar's in here. Sugar is there. So you see this in a lot of places. People were generally pretty upset about this. In 1890, a law was passed to try to stop this, to try to regulate this. That was called the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was named for the dude who wrote it, John Sherman, I believe. The Sherman Antitrust Act said that you can't do anything that negates the free market. Now, I've actually linked you into the text of the document here. Cornell Law is a really awesome source, by the way, if you're into legal history. And, you know, you have to write a paper on something in this class, and you need primary source documents. So this actually gives you the entirety of the law, right? But at first it was added to later. Trusts, otherwise conspiracy and restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is declared to be illegal. Awesome, right? You shouldn't be able to have those fat cats. The problem is, what is this? What is a trust or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce? These things were initially not very well defined, right? So you see that this first is passed in 1890 and you don't have amendments to it until much later, right? So how this is interpreted is actually really a matter of contention. We can see this in the fact that in 1890, is it 1895? I got it wrong, 1892. In 1892, the federal government tried to hold accountable a sugar company called the E.C. Knight Company. And the sugar company had recently acquired American Sugar, whatever, and they after that acquisition, controlled 98% of the sugar market in the United States. And what happened is that the case was brought before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that it wasn't a trust because refining sugar is a local activity, not an interstate activity, which is kind of a bullshit answer, right? It's kind of the, well, we don't have the authority to do this, but that's because the law wasn't super clear. Teddy Roosevelt actually made sure that this law had teeth, was actually used. He took a couple of major monopolies to task, especially in the railroads, and he actually had one dismantled. So he really pushed to have this law, which existed, which was on the books prior to when he was president. He really pushed to actually give it teeth. He also negotiated with labor. Now, if you notice, labor is not in here, right? Or in as much as laborers are consumers, but labor was not one of the main things that he took his presidency for. But he realized that the larger the corporation, the more control they had over their laborers. They could set prices and they could set wages and they could really abuse their workers. To Teddy Roosevelt, this was a problem in so much as it made the economy stop functioning. In 1902, there was a massive coal strike in Pennsylvania, in Appalachia. So by the way, if you were reading Hillbilly Elegy, this is a really, really great moment to connect that. In Appalachia, conditions were terrible. Conditions were terribly dangerous in the coal mines. People were suffering from black lung. People had no protection in the workplace against accidents. They had no guarantee of their jobs. They couldn't take any time off if they were sick. They'd be fired. So basically, coal miners were like, look, we need a set work day. We need to have protections in the workplace. We need to be listened to by management. We need to be able to talk about these things. Management refused to listen. And the standoff lasted quite a while. And the thing about coal is that it is the literal fuel of the economy. So Teddy Roosevelt was over there like, shit, okay, like I'm not on the side of the laborers on this. I'm not on the side of business, but if we don't have coal, our economy shuts down. We're not able to function. So Teddy Roosevelt did something that no president had ever done before, which is that he said, all right, let's hash this out. He got everybody in a room and he sat down and he talked to them. Before this, management had refused to cooperate with labor. And actually, over the course of the conversation, Teddy Roosevelt was like, hey, management are assholes. So like he managed to have a conversation about, look, it's in all of our best interests that the economy keeps functioning. I wouldn't call him a labor advocate, but he did, for the first time, propose a solution that did not involve sending the National Guard, right? Awesome sauce for him. He also worked for consumer protections. Now, this is really fun. Throughout the 19th century, there were basically no laws that protected consumers from what they were getting. I could perfectly legally shove a bunch of chalk in a bag and sell it to you as flour, which are things that people did, right? They actually adulterated flour with chalk a lot because it was more expensive to buy white flour than it was to buy wheat flour, which requires more refining. They would also do things like put cocaine in toothache drops. Like, yeah, of course, your teeth stop hurting if you have a bunch of cocaine. Alcohol was in nearly everything. Opium was in a lot of things. So, and it's not that, like, most people didn't understand those things as terribly bad. There was only growing evidence to understand how unhealthy they were towards the end of the 19th century. But there was also anger at the fact that nobody actually knew what was in a lot of the stuff that they were getting. Now, you see a lot of that in Upton Sinclair's work, right? Like people who are buying meat don't know what part of the hog is in that can of meat. And people are increasingly concerned about this. They're concerned about this because of outbreaks of things in cities. Like for instance, think about one of the things that industrialization does to food. Hold on, I'm going back. I'm a little scattered here. I apologize for that. One of the things that industrialization does to food is put the production of food in factories. So if there is tainted food, hundreds of people can be infected versus only a local area being infected. Imagine that one of the cows that goes through a slaughterhouse in Chicago has tuberculosis. That cow ends up all over the United States, right? When there's no protections for consumers like this, these things can be disastrous. So there's a lot of sickness, there's a lot of drug addiction, there's a lot of questionable practices by industries. Now, industries don't want regulation because regulation cuts into their profit margins. But Roosevelt, with a lot of support from the public, Upton Sinclair had already published his work, created the Food Purity Act. And the Food Purity Act would eventually turn into the Food and Drug Administration. And then it would lead to all sorts of other things like consumer protections in finance, and a whole bunch of other things would happen later in the 20th century. But for the first time, the federal government stepped in to regulate consumption. And it made it so that companies had to say what was in that meat. And it subjected meat factories to periodic inspections. And so in that sense, there was a belief that the federal government could do something to protect consumers. Teddy Roosevelt also was a nature conservationist. Boom. Conservationist. Teddy Roosevelt was also a conservationist. In fact, his nickname, Teddy, comes from Theodore, but the teddy bear was invented to honor him, which is like kind of my adorable story for the day, is that supposedly he was a great hunter and sportsman, and somebody had tied a black bear up to a tree so that he could shoot it. And he was like, I'm not going to shoot this animal. That's not sportsmanlike. And so people started making little bears and calling them teddy bears. Right? So if you ever had a teddy bear as a child, that's where that name comes from. Anyway, that was not the most important part of his conservationist work. Teddy Roosevelt also is responsible for creating a lot of national parks, like Yosemite National Park. He's responsible for a lot of monuments, making sure that national land was set aside for monuments. Responsible for game preserves and bird preserves. Bird preserves were not something that people had really thought about before, but ladies' hats had a lot of bird feathers in them. It's one of the reasons why we are really struggling with the flamingo population and all the birds. Do you know the kind of birds that we would have had in Galveston prior to the invention of ladies' hat fashions? It's pretty extraordinary. So this is why there's not a lot of whooping cranes and like large birds anymore, is because their feathers were highly prized. So a lot of the bird preserves that are actually like down here and in Florida and along the Gulf were established by Teddy Roosevelt. So go Roosevelt. Roosevelt was massively popular. He won the 1904 election. This is a 1908 election map. Sorry. He won the 1904 election in his own right, but he did not want to run for a third term. It was not in the Constitution yet that presidents could not run for a third term, but he opted to not. He said that that wasn't responsible. Instead, he basically said, Howard Taft will carry on my legacy. I endorse Howard Taft. And Howard Taft was forced to run against William Jennings Bryan, who ran again for the Democrats, indicating that the populists were still really popular, right? That they had sort of usurped that Democratic Party. But in the end, Taft won. And then Roosevelt was like, what the hell, dude? I thought we had an understanding. Because Taft did not do what Roosevelt thought that he was going to do. Taft, it turns out, really thought that Teddy Roosevelt had violated the office of the president because what he had done wasn't really by the books. And Taft was like, we can't do that. We have to function according to the law. And Roosevelt was like, if we function according to the laws don't get changed. And Taft was like, well, we can't do anything about that. Our hands are tied. So he actually didn't really do a lot of the active work that Teddy Roosevelt had done. And he was fairly unpopular for that. Actually, in the next election in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt was so mad that he left the Republican Party and he formed his own new party called the Progressive Party. He did not manage to win the election. Republicans idiotically renominated Taft. Taft was totally unpopular. He hardly won any votes at all. The Progressive Party actually won a significant amount of the vote, but not enough to really cope with the strength of the Democratic Party. The Democrats elected Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and then the focus of national politics would sort of shift abroad, because that's when 1914, World War I started. So we'll pick up there in international politics next. Nevertheless, the progressive era has left a lot of legacies. It was the first moment when the office of the presidency was like, no, these are the problems in the world, we're going to fix this shit. I am going to be active in fixing social problems as well as economic problems because the two are related. That was one of the ideas that Roosevelt left Americans with. I'm going to be active and I'm going to regulate the economy because problems in the economy lead to problems in the environment, in consumption, social problems. So I'm going to be active in that. He was just a magnanimous person. He was larger than life. He was a Rough Rider in the Spanish-American War. And people really looked to him as a new icon for what the office of the president would be. In short, being Woodrow Wilson was kind of like being a stand-up comedian, like right after someone really funny went on. It was just a bad gig, you know? Roosevelt was such a character that he left people with an expectation of what the presidency could be. That's what I've got for you today. I want you to be thinking about that governmental response to the heyday of capitalism that was the Gilded Age. All right, talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good day.